Hello, I am Matthew Aldis, and today I will introduce for you three of the letters attributed to the Apostle Paul. The letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, historically known as the pastoral epistles. These are letters that are believed historically to have been written by the Apostle Paul to disciples of his in the ministry who are now in charge of Christian communities in various parts of Asia Minor. And the letters are meant to help them address concerns in their communities, to establish order and decency, to establish a system of church government, and to combat false teachings that have crept into the church. Now, we say historically because traditionally the church has held that these letters were indeed penned by the historic figure Paul of Tarsus, the apostle who wrote Romans and Galatians. However, modern scholarship puts a different spin on it, looking at the letters as a whole compared to the other corpus of the undisputed letters of Paul. There are terms and there is specific vocabulary and language and syntax and themes that are unique to these letters themselves, terms that do not occur anywhere else in the New Testament. And so the general consensus is that these letters were not penned by the historic figure Paul. Rather, they were written pseudonymously in his name by a disciple, maybe as late as the early 2nd century. And so we will begin with the book of 1 Timothy, written to the figure Timothy, who is a co-laborer of Paul and often seen as a co-author of some of his letters. We learn about Timothy in the book of Acts. He's a convert who gets circumcised for the sake of the gospel in Jesus Christ. And so in this particular letter, Paul is addressing, or rather I should say the author in Paul's name is addressing two specific issues, the first of which is Pauline Christianity. What is required? What should the community of faith look like and how they should act? Paul's going to touch on things like detractors of Timothy. We're going to see the grace that Paul experiences and the scope of the gospel, how far it reaches, which is important in a community made up of Jews and Gentiles. Timothy's community is experiencing a need to understand gender roles in the ancient world and how men and women united in faith are supposed to coexist. We hear about bishops and deacons and how church government should be set up and what the responsibilities of both bishops and deacons are, what kind of characteristics these men should have, and then we touch on the mystery of faith, something that goes beyond human understanding. And then the second issue that Paul really wants to address is the behavioral expectations for Timothy. If we were to take this letter and think about it in a larger scope, it's what are the behavioral expectations for those who desire to be ministers of the gospel of God. We focus more in these sections on personal accounts of godliness. What is the inward character? What is the outward character that one should display should they seek to be a minister? And then we look at this picture of what it means to shepherd the church. How does one nurture the people of God, yet at the same time in a spirit of love and gentleness, correct sin when it creeps into the church? And so 1 Timothy is directed in that way. Then we go on to 2 Timothy, believed to have been written around the same time. Some scholars believe that if there was one of these three letters that is indeed authentic to Pauline scholarship, it would be 2 Timothy. It's actually believed that 2 Timothy may have been written before 1 Timothy because there are themes in the book of 1 Timothy that are borrowed from 2 Timothy. It's named 2 Timothy because of where it falls into our canon. This is shorter than 1 Timothy and has more of a personal appeal. In this letter, we begin to sense the loneliness and the suffering that the author goes through. Paul the apostle is portrayed as really experiencing the negative effects of suffering for the sake of the gospel. It may be in the face of death, which is right around the corner for Paul. He implores Timothy to make it a point to come and see him, knowing that his end may be coming to an end. And he wants to encourage Timothy in the light of the fact that Paul's life may be ending and that he has indeed fought the good fight of faith. He implores Timothy to carry on and to emulate the example. He wants Timothy to be committed to following his teachings. He wants Timothy to be committed to fighting the good fight of faith, to leading a congregation well, to being a person of high moral character, and to rooting out falsehood before it can take root in the church. It's believed by some that there was diversion or dissension in the church that was claiming that the resurrection or the second coming of Jesus had already taken place. And Paul wants to instruct Timothy that that is not indeed the case and that Timothy should be faithful in proclaiming the true gospel. Then we move along to the book known as Titus. Somewhere, written at some point between the 60s and possibly the early 2nd century, most likely anonymous. We don't have a lot of historical evidence for who Titus is. We believe that Titus is a Gentile convert to Christianity who is faithful to the gospel. He is uncircumcised, and he is a figure that the author uses to show this is a Gentile of high moral character who loves Jesus. You should emulate his conduct and character. What information we do know is contained mostly in the pastoral epistles, and it can't be substantiated through the texts of the New Testament. And so we simply don't know much about Titus beyond what is in the pastoral epistles. Possibly a Gentile convert to Christianity who is on the island of Crete, has been left there by the apostle to establish a Christian community there. He is tasked with setting up a structure that is led by bishops. We learn about the qualifications of bishops for the community in Crete, that they need to be men of high moral character who love Jesus and can rightly divide the word of truth and can establish a community in the veins and thoughts of Paul. Like Timothy, Titus is tasked with fighting false teachings because that brings dissension, which brings discord and keeps the community from being unified. Titus is to lean into the teachings that he has received from the apostle. And then, like the book of 1 Timothy, we learn about community relationships and gender roles and hierarchies, how men and women are supposed to interact, how older generations are supposed to interact with younger generations, how slaves and masters are supposed to interact with each other. Remember, this is 1st century Roman culture. It is not 21st century America. It simply is written for the sake of exhibiting unity among the Christian community. Now, some of you may be thinking, what is the point of reading these letters if they were not indeed penned by the historic apostle? That's a great question. I hope we continue to entertain that question as we dialogue. However, my personal opinion is that we read these letters as if they came from Paul's hand himself. The Christian community has found them to be faithful. That's why they were included in our canon. We trust in the witness of the Spirit working through the letters. Whether or not they were penned by the historic apostle, we will not know. But we can rest assured that the themes in which Paul would want us to know are at least contained in them. Specifically, the scope and size of God's grace as revealed in Jesus Christ, and the necessity for the church to be unified in its one firm foundation, which is Jesus. And we can see the heart and love that a apostle has for disciples in the faith. So I pray that as you read these, you would be encouraged, you would be challenged, you would ask lots of questions. May God bless you as you read these texts this week.